Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. I'm really honored to talk with you all tonight. You know, many people work on their theses totally alone, and I'm honored to, in this time when we can really feel so disconnected, have gotten to learn from and collaborate with LSP on this project. As Tom said, I'm a Memphian myself, and this thesis has really been an opportunity for me to reconnect with Memphis. So I've gotten to interview different people at LSP, got to learn from John's leadership, gotten to work alongside Rich and Pan and some of the others, and also learn from some of the coalitions who are connected to your network, who are working on the process of placing new memorials that uncover the history of racial terror in the South and all over the country. So for me, this thesis is really a fusion of my two homes, Memphis, where I grew up, and then Charlottesville, where I went to college. And I was in Charlottesville at the time of the Unite the Right rallies and saw the tangible threat that the Robert E. Lee statue had that it brought to the community. And for me, this sparked an interest in how community coalitions, urban planners, and designers can work together to counter Confederate iconography and reimagine the future of Confederate monuments that are being taken down all over the South. So I'm going to share with you all my screen tonight, and hopefully it'll work. Can you all see?
Yes.
Are we in? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. So the guiding questions of this project. First, how can community coalitions, urban planners, and designers collaboratively reimagine and redesign sites of former Confederate monuments? Second, as part of this larger effort to bring historical truth and racial justice to communities, how can LSP and many of the community coalitions that you all are in collaboration with create spaces that counter white supremacist icons? And then third, an academic question. As an urban planner, learning from and collaborating with your organization, what is the planner's role in facilitating inclusive, community-driven processes alongside organizations like you all to reclaim these spaces? And so I answer these questions through a two-part thesis. And tonight we're going to dig into part one, and then we're going to pause, see if you all are interested in discussing parts of part two. But this is really an invitation to you all if you're interested in joining on Thursday. Thursday I will present the thesis formally for my department, and that's when we're going to really dig into part two. But I am excited to hear your feedback, especially as I revise over the coming days. So the chapters of part one are shown here. And they will all be made available to you all, to members of your vast network. And I'm going to show tonight photos of the book that you'll have access to. The chapters are the context of Confederate monument removal. What is the purpose of these symbols? And what is this recent era of removal that we've seen? Then the case study of Memphis as a precedent for other community coalitions and people who are interested in removing their future to look towards. Third, strategies for redesign, the processes for designing new landmarks and new monuments that might shed light on the history of racial terror. And then fourth, resources and precedents for LSP and other community coalitions who are interested in this process of creating new landmarks that might counter Confederate symbols. And then I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what part two is about if you want to join on Thursday or if you have additional questions once we finish part one. Part two is a precedent RFP, which means a request for proposals for the redesign of Health Sciences Park in Memphis. And I want to say from the beginning that this is not about the duplicate EJI monument, which many of you all know about, and this is not about me designing a space for this park. This is about reconsidering and reimagining all the steps that are involved in one particular controversial place and exploring everything someone might have to think about when redesigning this site. So these chapters outline what a community-driven process for the site of the Forest Monument might look like, seeking a future design that simultaneously disrupts, memorializes, and heals. Then they serve as a resource for the Memphis Medical District Collaborative, for Memphis Green Space, and the city, who have all expressed interest in redesign. And then third, a tool for LSP and other community organizations interested in facilitating or being a part of these redesign processes. Before we go any further, we got to address the elephant in the room, which is, why is this thesis in collaboration with LSP? Is this mission drift for your organization? The second part is really for you all to decide, but here's why I think this is a strong collaboration for us. First, because we have a shared effort to memorialize the history of racial terror and to counter Confederate iconography. Second, in response to Equal Justice Initiative's charge to place duplicate monuments, considering the powerful impact of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the need for more spaces like it that share true history. And I'm going to talk tonight about how that memorial was created and what processes look like for future spaces like that. Third, this belief that new monuments will not tell the history themselves, to quote Karen Brennan, who's part of the LSP network. And this is really the heart of the thesis. You know, without building these community relationships, without hosting conversations about the historic purposes of these places, without designing from the margins to envision these futures, these new monuments will not be impactful at all. And I draw a lot on John's leadership when I discuss this, because as John has said to many of you all, if you place a marker and your voice is the only one heard and you walk away, you haven't done anything. And that's why this thesis is really a commitment to building relationships between LSP and its vast network, between planners and designers and community coalitions like LSP, realizing that urban planners for these sites have a lot to learn from you all's commitment to relationship building and to hosting challenging conversations. And then LSP might have something to learn from urban planners' tools for redesign of these spaces. So we're going to jump into part one, the context. And I'm going to walk through these 4 chapters. The context. First, the purposes of Confederate monuments is the most important thing to address when we talk about these spaces. Second, what is this new era we've seen of their removal? Third, what local knowledge must drive the designs? And then fourth, what is the true history that designs need to uncover? And so I began the thesis by sharing a historical timeline of when these statues were built, which makes it clear that these statues were meant to assert a deeply racial, social, and political hierarchy, and to assert a defeat over the North and Black rights and Black suffrage. So for people who say this was an effort to remember their loved ones who died, there's a moment when that is true, and that is during Reconstruction. And so we can look at how these monuments were placed. You know, in Reconstruction, they were actually all placed in cemeteries. They were all obelisks, they were cannonballs, and there was no large town monument visible then. Then, during the Jim Crow era, Reconstruction ends, lynchings rise throughout the South, Jim Crow laws expand, KKK membership expands, and in the 1890s, when there is the peak of lynching in the South, that is when the first non-cemetery Confederate monuments are made. And there's a seminal text on Confederate monuments by John Widener, who says, 1895 was the year that the Confederate monument entered the town square. It left the cemetery and entered the town square. And the very next year was when Plessy versus Ferguson legalized segregation. And the 1890s was also when Ida B. Wells, who reported on lynchings in Memphis, had to flee the city for her life after she was threatened with lynchings. So this rise in Confederate monuments in town squares and urban spaces was directly related to the end of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, and then from 1900 to 1920 is a really critical time of these monuments being constructed. And in that time, more monuments are constructed than any other moment, any other era in history. And this is the era that historians called lost causism, when the South asserts its victory over Reconstruction, the North, and Black rights. And this is when we see the most monuments constructed. It's also when we see the resurgence of the KKK, and the film The Birth of a Nation is released in 1915, which is also a critical year because that's a time when the media starts creating other outlets to glorify Confederate history. And so after this film is released, there's a bit of a decline in the need for more physical statements, since now film is available and other media outlets. So through the Jim Crow era, monuments are still created steadily, but there's not another spike again to the civil rights movement. And that's when we see a spike in monuments created directly in response to the gains and the successes of the civil rights movement. So following this historical timeline, the question emerges, can we even call these monuments? If these are really a celebration of defeating Reconstruction, a celebration of defeating Black rights, Black suffrage, a rebranding strategy for the South as it focuses on, as it tries to rebuild itself following losing the Civil War. These are really an assertion of racial, political, and cultural hierarchy, and they're historically inaccurate symbols to heritage, not to history. In my thesis, I call them monuments for a few reasons, practical and theoretical. The practical reason is just to limit confusion. Calling them markers or other symbols or posts can also refer to other Confederate symbols. And it's really important, you know, when groups talk about the future of monuments, they're using the word monuments. So it's helpful to call it what the public calls it. Also to highlight the importance of their removal, as calling them markers can kind of overlook that purpose of displaying more powerful symbols of white supremacist authority. And then to say that monuments can be contested, they can be made to unjust people, unjust causes, and they are for us to critique also. So on Thursday, I'm going to present a timeline of what the monument removal has looked like. But for now, we're going to walk through the recent spikes. 2015 and 2017, post-white supremacist attacks, we see this new era of monuments being removed across the South especially, but also across the country. 3 out of 5 of the Tennessee removals were in Memphis. And in my thesis, I present where these removals are across the US. They are many times in the South. The orange dots here are monuments removed, but they're also all over. There's some in LA, there's some in other parts of California, there's one in Montana, there's one in Boston even. And so the question emerges, what is the future of these sites with now 52 monuments vacant across the US? How can planners, designers, and community organizations approach their future? So I turn to Memphis as an example, looking at the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest throughout history, the story of its monument removal, the use of the park today, and the redevelopments the park needs. So I walk through the statue through history from when the sons and daughters of the Confederacy purchased, well actually they got the land for free from the city, but they raised $35,000 to erect the statue. And then in 1905, when the crowd raises the flag of the Confederate States of America, not just the flag of the Confederacy, but actually of the nation the Confederacy wanted to build, sings Dixie and declares that this statue stands for the heroic deeds and the proud heritage of all American citizens. And so throughout history, we can see many different ways the monument is described. I think the 1906 article is really powerful in showing its attempt to revise history. It described the dedication as this brilliant tribute to General Forrest and will be so chronicled when the history of his eventful career is revised. So specifically saying they wanted later generations to revise that history and see him in another light. And the first ever vandalism for the statue begins around the 30s, when the sword is stolen. Paint is splashed on it in the decades that follow. The NAACP takes up leadership in the 1980s, calling for its removal. And then in the 1990s, actually, Rosa Parks protests at the statue, calling for its removal, and counter-protesting there is Civil War historian Shelby Foote. But then we see this big push for removals in 2017, immediately after Charlottesville's Unite the Right rallies. And the local activists that I interviewed all point to Charlottesville as this moment where local movements were reignited to make city spaces reflect their values. Following their push for removal and the city's decision to privatize the statue, as many people, as many Memphians on this call know, the city made a call to sell its monuments to Memphis Green Space, and they did that by selling the land the monuments were on. So the 2 parks were sold, each for $1,000, and now this nonprofit owns the park space. You can see the vacant statues. So what does the park look like today is a really big question when we discuss the future of it and what the capacity is to redesign it. It's now in the center of the Memphis Medical District. It is both a pass-through and a respite for all these healthcare workers, for students, for patients at the nearby multiple children's hospitals that are nearby, and there are actually 7 medical institutions all in this area around the park. And then when we zoom in to what the park itself looks like, it's 9 acres. And opposite of the statue, there are many students and employees who are moving through it all the time. There's actually heavily programmed weekly Zumba, weekly DJ series. There are food trucks right here, and I have later graphics showing, how these people move through the spaces. But at the same time, there are critical redevelopments needed for this park. People say again and again, a cloud is hung over the whole place because of the statue. This park, many people don't go because of the symbol of hatred. People say it was supposed to be a public park, but no one feels welcome here. And then there are also just there are problems associated with the park in terms of it doesn't drain, its walkways are not ADA accessible, it has broken benches, broken picnic tables, and this is really a site that the city also views in need of redevelopment as well. So what does it look like if you see a place like this and you are a community coalition and you say, we want to lead a charge for redesigning this space? This is what this chapter outlines. And the purpose of this is to first say, what are the goals of LSP and its network? To emphasize that you all are not a memorial building dedicated group, but you may be interested in being the people who lead and facilitate those processes. Second, the steps of a design process with your members' commentaries along the way. What is each step you need to do, from partnering with local coalitions, to engaging community members and ideas, to the fundraising, to the construction, to the future program. And then, what are the ways that designers are actually chosen? And I think a critical point of this thesis is that community coalitions and planners and designers, we operate in these totally different worlds. So how do we actually bridge the divide between the world of community coalitions like you all and the designers of these spaces to make these designs relevant, meaningful, and actually related to the kind of community conversations and relationships that you all are building? And then precedent design processes for memorials to civil rights leaders, for memorials to victims of racial terror, and also memorials that have been on landscapes of trauma and landscapes that need future healing. There are some interesting precedents that as an organization we can all look at together. So to begin with, what does a design process actually look like? LSP is a great model for the first few steps of a deeply community-driven design process. Karen Brennan, in one of my first conversations with an LSP member said, I pay less attention to community building than I do to monument building than I do to community building and to relationship building. So convening a community coalition, seeking partners who are also interested, the kind of relationships that you all seek to form across Memphis and across the South and also across the nation. Share, actually uncovering the history of these sites, giving people the tools to talk about the history of racism and how it's affected them. Facilitating and hosting listening sessions around the future of these spaces. And in the steps of the redesign for this specific park, I have some examples of what it could look like for LSP to be a part of facilitating conversations about the futures of such spaces. But everything from hosting community conversations at the site to having people just draw up some of their early ideas, engaging people, relying on John's insight of making sure folks at the margin are heard. And that earlier comment I mentioned, if your voice is the only voice heard and you put up a marker, you haven't changed anything. So I offer an example of a New Orleans project that's gathered more than 1,000 visions for the future of monuments across New Orleans. And then proposals were turned into these public art installations and across the city. And then the next 4 steps being fundraising, relying on insight from Memphis planners who say not a single park in this city that has seen new improvements has seen them because of public dollars. It is really critical to do local fundraising because private investments are what make these projects happen. And I wish there was more involvement from the public side, but that's another thesis and LSP talk. Then co-design. What does it look like to get everyone in one room, not just have a few power brokers who decide on the future of a space? Finalizing the space, relying on my conversations with David Johnson about deciding on a design that shares actually the context of the space and what was here before, while also thinking about all the people who currently use it, and then constructing the site to create a place where people who are different from each other can enter and discuss what happened together. So, what are the processes of finding a designer, interacting with designers? What are the different steps that people take to move their early visions and discussions into example proposals and designed spaces? A competition, a request for proposals, and the direct identification are the three common steps to know about. Competition, putting out a call for ideas. This is saying, you know, we are interested in the future of this one space. Anyone who wants to put out their ideas can, reviewing the submissions, and then having a public exhibition of the ideas. And I'm going to walk through some pros and cons and some examples of these different pathways for selecting a designer. The second, the request for proposals, is a more involved process, often when a specific site is chosen and you want to actually get a few designers to develop really robust ideas for that site. And you might fund those designers. $5,000 each is typical for them to then turn some of your early conversations into ideas. You can review and showcase their proposals and then have a jury and a public design selection process. And there are many different ways that RFPs happen, but we'll talk a little about that. And then the third example is direct identification. You seek the approval and then you contact the designer who you know you want to do this, and they show you what they want to do. And the reason I add this in is because many places just do this process if they have a vision for a site already. And so that's what Equal Justice Initiative did with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Actually, in the deed, when they purchased the land from the city and they got the ordinance to build on it, they actually identified Michael Murphy and Mass Design as the designers for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. So they already knew who was going to do it from the beginning. And when I talked with one of my professors who works very closely with Mass Design about that process, he described being with Mass Design in the room when they were thinking of what goes into the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and they were discussing, you know, they were thinking about having trees instead of the hanging boxes that they have. So they initially thought, what if we went to all the different trees all over the South and collected seeds from the trees where a lynching happened and then grew trees. And so as an organization, they knew that they were commissioned to do this and they could just let their ideas run wild about what they might propose for a site. So the pros and cons of these different processes, I think the best way to share them is to just offer some examples of what they look like, because, you know, sometimes when we just talk about them in the abstract, it becomes less clear of what it actually looks like to take every step of these processes. So I offer 6 precedents in the thesis, but I'll just walk through a couple of them. The Monument Avenue competition was a competition in Richmond, Virginia to reimagine the 5.4-mile historic boulevard of Confederate general statues throughout Richmond. And they asked people all over the US to submit their ideas, and they also held a separate competition for youth to submit their ideas as well. And they gathered all of these visions, so more than 1,000 submissions, and then they displayed them in a museum in downtown Richmond, and they had the public go and visit them and respond and say, you know, I like this one, I don't like this one, and here are the reasons. So the purpose of this is really just to generate ideas, generate public discussion about a site before anything is done. Whereas the King Boston RFP was a request for proposals process to identify future designers of a Dr. King Memorial in the center of Boston. And this was a much more, this process involves many more steps to actually figure out who's going to design this future site. And what they did was they put out a request for qualifications, is what it's called. They ask people to submit the kinds of projects they've worked on before and to submit everything that they do as a firm and who they are as a firm. And so the designers that respond, from those designers, then they select finalists to compete for their vision. And from the finalists, 3 designs were projected in the Boston Public Library, where more than 1,000 people came and commented and said what they liked and didn't like, and then a selection committee chooses the future design. I have some more examples in the thesis, specifically the National Pulse Memorial and Museum, which is on the site where the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting happened. And this is a really involved process to memorialize the gay nightclub shooting that has really created this landscape of terror. And they created a really incredible process of healing, letting the public come and put up their ideas on a temporary installation. So what are more processes closer to home in Memphis and the South? One process that John asked me to look into was the Ed Johnson project. This is a process that happened in Chattanooga, and it is a group. I don't know if there may be someone here tonight who is connected and knows this process much better than I do, but this is a group who is memorializing the lynching of Ed Johnson, which happened on the Walnut Street Bridge. And they used the RFP format. So what they did was they put out this request for qualification, and they said, we're calling for designers to reimagine this site to create a memorial that they identified would be welcoming, contemplative, mournful, inspirational. They outlined the budget for it, and then they said, this is what we're looking for. From that, they chose 3 finalists, and then they projected the ideas of the finalists they made them very public online, and they had a committee select the ideas from that. And then we already talked about the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. So maybe in the Q&A, we can talk more about what these processes look like, but this is just an early description of what all the steps are that are taken. So why a request for proposals? Why does the thesis then suggest that that is a possibility for the forest site? There are 3 strong advantages of a request for proposals that I outline, and then I walk through all these different steps and show what strong components of this RFP there are to consider. So the advantages of an RFP are that it does set up a really transparent process. You can create a website where you say, we are releasing this request for proposals, but you can also create a space where you showcase all the different examples that are given. You can project them in the park. You can project them in the Brooks Museum of Memphis, for example. And RFPs can be really open-ended. So something LSP members have expressed interest in is possibly cultivating a required reading list for designers before they even begin thinking about a future of a space, saying, here are pieces we want you to read, here's the page we want you all to be on before you partner with us. And they can require a level of community engagement that a designer responds to and that a designer keeps to, even after they've been selected. I also use an RFP as a process for this thesis because it's just a more involved process. So I think this tool could be more helpful for other community coalitions who may be saying, we want to create a memorial for Ida B. Wells, for a more involved EJI duplicate, for to counter Confederate icons that are near us. This is a specific roadmap for what that more involved process looks like. So I walk through all the different steps from preparing the vision, where you think about every component that a designer may need to know, releasing this request for qualifications, which is optional, but I recommend it because it is a really good way to get strong designers who have experience to submit their ideas. And then issuing the RFP, include approvals, letter of support, reviewing submissions, and I outline a process where you can host a public review, selecting the designers. What does it look like to convene a jury of designers and community members, and then also reserve a vote for the public in this process, or multiple votes. And another important thing is thinking about who's on this jury, making sure that it is representative of both people who know how memorials last over the years and how they're designed, but also community members who have been a part of leading discussions, who have been a part of removing a statue, broadening the scope of who sits on that jury. And then step 6, what do you need to do to collaborate to build the monument itself, to let the community members know how the process is unfolding, to hire local builders in that process. So what are the components of this RFP? This is more so what Thursday is about, but to give you all a sneak peek, it begins with overview and goals, where we say, in this proposed project, our coalition is seeking design proposals for the 9-acre site. This design should reconcile with the Confederate monument. It should uncover this history. It should generate public discussion, remembrance, and healing. Then outlining the history of Forest Park, how designers have to know this history, encounter with this history, and be in conversation with this for their future proposals. Then what is the park used for today? And this is the real challenge of this future design, is this park has to provide for the daily use of this site as a space that healthcare workers are constantly visiting on their breaks, that patients from the nearby hospitals go to. This park has a critical role, and also discussing how the pandemic has only highlighted the need for these spaces to be more present, more inclusive. Spaces that have had former Confederate monuments are certainly not inclusive, but how do we also design a future space that people can use on a daily basis, that they can take their lunch breaks on, they can work out around, that doesn't also affect the tone and the mood of the space and seem irreverent for that future space. Memphis and the Southern context, what should a design be in conversation with around the city of Memphis? I also have some maps of community collaborators to be in conversation with. And then what does a community engagement process look like? What is a designer going to respond to? And I outlined 3 possible phases of community engagement that LSP and Facing History and ourselves could collaborate with to facilitate some of those phases. And then what are the guidelines and the requirements of this future site, from a 1.2 million budget if we are talking about a full landscape redesign, to required materials, required ADA accessible pathways. And then the final section is a selections, public voting, and review process. So who sits on a jury? How do we engage the public in selecting the design? And then from there, how do we hold the designers accountable to collaborating alongside community members as they achieve the final design and as we construct the final product? So I'm gonna stop there.